greater sign that the Republican Party has turned its back on protecting the right to vote, one of the most fundamental rights in our democracy, than the fact that just one Republican senator, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, supports the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. NBC News reports that in light of voting rights legislation coming up against a wall of GOP obstruction, Democrats are very close to a deal that can get the support of all 50 Democratic senators. But of course, as we cover all the time around here, that bill will not pass with the filibuster in place. And on that front, sources tell Rolling Stone, quote, President Joe Biden and his advisors have said in recent weeks that Biden will pressure wavering Democrats to support reforming the filibuster if necessary to pass the voting bill. Our next guest, who's all too often the first, last, middle line of defense against voter suppression bills, describes the situation this way, quote, there is no place in the Republican Party for supporters of voting rights. It is time for Democrats to make peace with the fact that they will need to take decisive action alone. History will remember their bravery when they do. Let's bring into our coverage Mark Elias, voting rights attorney and founder of the Democracy Docket. We cover your efforts when you're here and when you're not here. Can you first just give us the lay of the land? We spent a lot of time when Abbott signed into law Texas's voting restrictions. It's clear that everything that was banned yielded zero fraud in 2020. And I wonder if you can tell us what we're not necessarily paying attention to, but that's equally concerning to you.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me again, Nicole. And you're right. As our attention as a society moves from one topic to the next, and it's not to suggest that these are not important topics to be covered, it's important to recognize that Republican legislatures around the country are still hard at work undermining democracy and passing anti-voting legislation. So the Texas bill that just went into effect, SB 1, that you referred to, is actually the third Texas bill passed this year that targeted voting rights. It was the big one. It was the one that got most of the attention, but there had been two prior bills already in place that targeted the voting rights of Texans. That's on top of laws, as we know, in Georgia and Florida, but it's also on top of bad voting laws in Arkansas, in Kansas, in Montana, in Iowa. So it's really, the big lie has infected every nook and cranny of the Republican Party and its legislative efforts to pass anti-voting laws. And
I mean, what I think is really the dangerous thing to ignore is that when you pin them down, no one can point to any fraud because there wasn't any. Not Bill Barr, not Chris Krebs, not Mitch McConnell. So these laws are being pushed through with extraordinary support in the Republican legislatures and from Republican voters, all based on that lie. When you pull the thread, where does that land in your view?
Yeah, so first of all, you're exactly right. It's not just that there was no evidence of fraud, but the bills themselves don't even make any sense as efforts to prevent fraud. So, for example, the Texas bill you just mentioned, or we started with, it bans drive-through voting, which means that basically it bans allowing people to cast their ballots on voting machines while sitting in their cars, as opposed to while standing outside their cars on foot. Like, there's no way to argue that that's an anti-fraud bill. The banning of drop boxes is not an anti-fraud measure. There's no fraud associated with drop boxes. There's not even fraud alleged in connection with drop boxes. So when you match up the bills to what they claim about fraud, they don't even make sense. But where this is going is pretty clear, which is that Republicans believe that they cannot win elections fair and square. They can't win them by attracting the votes of the majority of the voters who are eligible to vote. So they are left to change the rules of the game, to make it harder to register, to make it harder to vote, to make it harder to have your vote count, and then finally, and most ominously, to eventually undermine the way in which elections are certified and reported out.
And we don't spend enough time, people in my line of work, explaining that. It's happening in Georgia, where they're reviewing, I think, the largest Democratic pocket of votes in the state of Georgia. They are literally rigging the counting. So these really aren't just voter restriction laws. They're potentially voter nullification laws. Explain what that means in practical terms, and
Yeah,
with
so
2020
I sometimes
fresh.
when I'm asked how did I get into this field, I say I took an unusual path. Most lawyers in this area start with voter registration and then move through the voting process. I began as a recount lawyer. And so I've always been very attentive to what the rules are for how ballots are counted and then elections are certified. And remember, it was during the 2020 general election aftermath that we saw first the state of Texas seek to invalidate the election results in 4 states. That failed in the Supreme Court. And then what did we see? Remember, then what we saw was the President of the United States himself calling local canvass board officials in Michigan, asking them first not to certify the results in or include the results in Detroit, and then not to certify the state at all. And that's in some ways become the weak point in this process that we're seeing Republicans target, which is that if they can put in place people who oversee the certification of elections, those people can simply say that if the Democrat got 5 votes and the Republican got 3 votes, either that 3 is larger than 5 or that 5 doesn't exist. And that is what we are ultimately going to have to fight against, along with the other laws dealing with voting itself.
Republicans killed a bipartisan commission to understand how their lives were put in danger on January 6th. That's how hostage they are to Trump and Trumpism. The only thing Trump cared about more than killing a bipartisan, equally represented commission was rigging the vote, was making his call to Raffensperger a call to a Steve Bannon-like person in Raffensperger's job. That is the path down which they're heading. Where does this delusion come from that there could be a bipartisan solution to voting rights?
So, look, I think the solution to this is not going to be found in bipartisanship. You know, part of the piece I wrote today is just time to throw in the towel and realize that there are more Republicans right now in the House of Representatives with a failing grade from the NRA than voted for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Think about that. Not Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, not Kinzinger from Illinois, not a single so-called moderate Republican who you might think would break on this or that was willing to break on voting rights, because it is the one thing that holds the modern Republican Party together. Even, Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, who are otherwise, being sensible on the January 6th Commission, can't stomach the idea of allowing everyone to vote, because that is the existential threat to the Republican Party today, is that everyone's able to participate and elections are certified accurately. So I think the bipartisan idea needs to be put to rest.
So what is your blunt message on doing away with the filibuster when it comes to federal voting rights legislation?
Look, I think the sooner we come to terms with the fact that this is going to be a party line vote, the better. I recall, as I'm sure you do, in 2009 and 2010, how much time was spent trying to find that miraculous Republican senator who was going to vote for the Affordable Care Act. And what it did is it wasted precious time on the Senate calendar, and it meant a delay in the implementation of a much needed law. Now we look back, more than a decade later, and we see there are 31 million Americans who have been covered as a result. History will judge not the process by getting this law passed, but that it was passed. And I promise that the Democrats who stand up in favor of voting and voting rights will be rewarded by the historians for what they did in this time of trouble. And they will not be viewed as unnecessarily partisan. And why didn't they work with Republicans?